Question: is this the worst sound in the world for a Looney Tunes fan to hear? If you're a die-hard classic cartoon fan, that version of the Looney Tunes theme probably sends a chill down your spine. Because when you heard that arrangement, you knew you weren't getting Prime Bugs Bunny, you weren't getting Chuck Jones at his best, you were getting something different. And today I want to explain why. This is the story of how the original Looney Tunes studio, the one that gave us Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, the Roadrunner, and some of the greatest animated shorts ever made, sputtered to an end. Not with a bang, but with budget cuts, subcontracted cartoons, and of course a tiger named Cool Cat. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to the early 1960s. The theatrical cartoon short was dying. Television had changed the economics of entertainment, and studios were questioning whether it still made sense to spend money producing 7-minute cartoons for theatrical release. Warner Brothers had already been tightening the purse strings for years. Budgets were shrinking, the shorts were getting cheaper to make, and the golden generation of directors, the ones who had built the Looney Tunes into what it was, were starting to scatter. In 1962, Chuck Jones was fired from Warner Brothers. The official reason? He'd been moonlighting, working on the animated feature Depatie for UPA without the studio's permission. Whatever the politics behind it, the result was the same. One of the greatest animation directors in history was out the door. And then in spring of 1963, Jack Warner made it official. The Warner Brothers Cartoon Studio, the place that had been producing Looney Tunes and Merrie Melodies since the early 1930s, was shut down. Now technically this wasn't the first time the studio had closed its doors. Back in 1953, the 3D filming craze led Warner Brothers to briefly shut down the cartoon division, but when the fad fizzled out almost as quickly as it arrived, the studio reopened and carried on. This time though, it was different. This wasn't a hiccup. After roughly 3 decades of nearly continuous production, it was over. Except it wasn't. Not quite, because Warner Brothers still had a problem. They still needed new cartoons for theatrical distribution. The solution? Outsource them. But before we get to the outsourcing era, there's a curious footnote that bridges the old studio to the new one. In the final stretch of the original studio's run, 3 shorts were released that looked different. They ditched the classic Looney Tunes Bullseye and Merrie Melodies rings in favor of a new abstract title card, featuring a reorchestrated theme by composer Bill Lava. The first was Now Hear This in 1963, directed by none other than Chuck Jones. It was an experimental, almost avant-garde short, one of the most visually adventurous things the studio ever produced. Then came Bartholomew vs. the Wheel and Cinderella and the Grass Huarache in 1964, directed by Robert Kimpson and Holly Pratt respectively, both using that same new title card. All 3 of these were artsy shorts, experimental in tone as if the studio was testing a new creative direction before the lights went out. After the studio closed, David H. Depatie, who had been the final head of the Warner Brothers cartoon division, and Freleng, one of the studio's longest-serving directors, who'd been there almost from the very beginning, formed Depatie-Freleng Enterprises, are probably best known today for creating the Pink Panther cartoon series, which launched in 1964 after their animated title sequence for the Blake Edwards film became a surprise sensation. The Pink Panther would go on to become one of the most recognizable cartoon characters of the era, and DFE parlayed that success into a remarkable run. The studio operated from 1963 all the way to 1981, producing an enormous catalogue of work including The Inspector, The Ant and the Aardvark, and numerous other TV specials and series. For a small studio born out of the ashes of the WB cartoon division, their longevity and output were genuinely impressive. But alongside all that original work, DFE also took on a contract to continue producing Looney Tunes and Merrie Melody shorts for Warner Brothers theatrical release. And this is where the quality issue starts. Depatie-Freleng were running a lean operation, perhaps too lean. Budgets were slashed, crews were smaller, the lush backgrounds, the full orchestral scores, the meticulous timing that had defined the classic era, much of that was simply no longer affordable. The result was a run of cartoons from roughly 1964 to 1967 that, well, let's just say they're not the ones that will end up on anyone's best of lists. Here's something a lot of people don't realize about the Depatie-Freleng Looney Tunes era. For whatever reason, most of the characters were off limits for these new shorts. Bugs Bunny, Elmer Fudd, Yosemite Sam, Tweety, and the Tasmanian Devil, none of them were available for regular use. The characters that were cleared for production were a much smaller roster, so you had Daffy Duck, Speedy Gonzales, you had some Sylvester in there, you had Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote, and even the Goofy Gophers. And there were even a few strange exceptions, like Pancho's Hideaway featured what was essentially a Spanish accented version of Yosemite Sam, close enough to the character to raise eyebrows, but apparently different enough to fly under the radar. Cats and Bruises from 1965 is a minor curiosity too, a Sylvester and Speedy pairing which harken back to the original studio dynamic rather than the Daffy and Speedy formula that dominated this era. And then there's the truly hot case of Corner the Cop, directed by Irv Spector in 1965, which somehow got permission to use both Granny and Porky Pig. And that short actually marked the final golden age appearances of both those characters, and it stands as a real curiosity of that period. Witch Hazel also made an appearance in A Haunting Will Go, so it was likely that just certain side characters were allowed versus some of the A-listers, like Bugs Bunny or Elmer Fudd, were allowed to be used. But the net effect of these restrictions was that the Depatie-Freleng era was built almost entirely around two pairings, Daffy and Speedy, and the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote. And with a limited cast, the formula wore thin very quickly. If you ever watched a Looney Tunes short around this time and suddenly found yourself watching Daffy Duck chasing Speedy Gonzales through Mexico for the millionth time in a row, this is the era that's responsible for it. The Daffy and Speedy pairing became the default formula for the Depatie-Freleng years, and there are actually a few reasons for that. First, and this is important, Speedy Gonzales was enormously popular in Latin America markets. In fact, he still is. He was a proven draw internationally, so the studio just decided to lean heavily on the character. Secondly, Daffy Duck by this point was the go-to antagonist. He'd already been evolving into a more of a foil character since the late 1950s, and pairing him against Speedy gave the writers a ready-made dynamic. Daffy wants to catch Speedy, Speedy outsmarts him, it was simple, it was repeatable, and it was cheap to produce. And yes, there were a few minor exceptions to that formula here and there. The problem is that without strong directors putting their own personal stamp on the material, these shorts became formulaic. The spark that made the classic, say, Daffy vs. Bugs shorts work, the character-driven comedy, was largely missing. What you got instead was a lot of going through the motions. After being fired from Warner Brothers in 1962, Chuck Jones landed at MGM, where he took over the Tom and Jerry series and later directed the beloved TV special How the Grinch Stole Christmas in 1966. This matters to our story because that meant that the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote, characters that Jones, along with Mark Maltese, had created, and they were deeply tied to his very specific comedic sensibility, were now being made without him. But the Roadrunner was another hugely popular series, one that Warner Brothers had no intention of retiring, so the Roadrunner shorts were outsourced, mostly to Format Films, a studio that also handled television animation work. The most notorious result of this arrangement was a series of 11 Roadrunner cartoons directed by Rudy Larriva, who actually animated for Chuck Jones back in the late 1930s, and these were sometimes referred to as the Larriva 11. These shorts were produced between 1965 and 1966 and are widely considered to be the weakest Roadrunner cartoons ever made. Where Jones's Roadrunner shorts had meticulous comedic timing, elaborate gag setups, and a genuine sense of escalation, the Larriva cartoons were just flat. The gags didn't build, the animation was stiff, and the scores were largely stock music rather than the brilliant Carl Stalling and Milt Franklin compositions that had defined the classic era. Everything that made Roadrunner cartoons work was stripped away. Now, Bob McKimson actually took a few cracks at the format, and they were considered somewhat of a step up above the Larriva batch, but due to the budget cuts, he simply could not recapture the brilliance that Jones had brought to the series. Now, before you think this entire era was a wasteland, I actually do want to try and be fair. Were there any highlights? Are any shorts worth seeking out from this period? The one that almost everyone points to is The Wild Chase from 1965, directed by Friz Freleng himself. And the premise alone tells you why it stands out. It's a race between Speedy Gonzales and the Roadrunner. with Sylvester and Wile E. Coyote both trying to catch their respective targets. It's a crossover event, the Looney Tunes equivalent of a Marvel team-up, and it works largely because Freleng brought genuine energy and comedic timing to it. Although it is worth noting, the Wild Chase is yet another cheetah cartoon. Most of the animation is actually lifted from earlier Chuck Jones shorts, with Sylvester drawn into the scenes. And honestly, that tells you a lot about how this era operated. Reusing animation from earlier entries was a key cost-cutting strategy throughout this period, and the Wild Chase is one of the most high-profile examples. But even so, the way Freleng stitched it all up together still gave it more energy than most of what was being produced at the time. Beyond that, a handful of the Speedy Gonzales shorts hold up reasonably well, particularly the ones Freleng directed personally, where you still feel a veteran's hand guiding the comedy, but these are the exceptions, not the rule. In 1967, Seven Arts Productions purchased Warner Brothers, forming Warner Brothers-Seven Arts. And one of the decisions that came out of that merger was to reopen the animation studio and bring cartoon production back in-house. On paper, that sounds like good news. In practice, it was complicated. The reopened studio was put under the supervision of Alex Lovey, who had previously worked at Walter Lantz Productions. Lovey was tasked with getting the machine running again, but he was working with those pesky limited budgets, a small crew, and none of the veteran directors who had defined the classic era, except later on Bob McKimson. One notable change in the Seven Arts era: the Roadrunner was done. There was no new Roadrunner cartoons produced during this period. Instead, the studio had doubled down on what they had, which meant more Daffy and Speedy team-ups, but also a push to create entirely new characters. Interestingly, this is where we get a wave of new faces, the studio's attempt to find the next Bugs Bunny or Daffy Duck. Did they succeed? Well, we all know the answer, but let's go through it anyway. The most prominent of these new characters was Cool Cat, a hip, laid-back tiger who spoke in beatnik-style slang. Definitely a timeless character, right?
Have you any last requests? As a matter of fact, I have.
Cat appeared in a series of shorts starting in 1967, usually being hassled by a hunter named Colonel Rimfire. And honestly, he felt less like a Looney Tune and more of a cousin of, like, the Pink Panther. Sure, Depatie-Freleng didn't make the Cool Cat shorts, but it felt like they did. Then there was Merlin the Magic Mouse, a conman mouse with a W.C. Field style voice, very timely at the time of course, and his sidekick Second Banana. They appeared in a handful of shorts, but they never really found a consistent comic identity. Bunny and Claude were a pair of rabbits, a direct parody of Bonnie and Clyde, which was a smash hit for Warner Brothers in 1967. Topical? Sure. Timeless? Nope. Though I'll give credit where credit's due. The Bob McKimson directed entries aren't nearly as bad as their reputation suggests. But now I want to talk about the strangest thing to come out of this era, and honestly, maybe the best? On February 3rd, 1968, Warner Brothers 7 Arts released a short called Norman Normal, and it was unlike anything the studio had ever produced. Not even anything from the main studio produced anything like this. Now, Norman Normal wasn't a Looney Tune, it wasn't a Merrie Melody, it was released as a one-time cartoon special. And there's a good reason for that, because Norman Normal has no catchphrases or wacky antics, no anvils, no explosions. Norman Normal is just a man, a ball-bearing salesman walking through the doors of his own mind, commenting on the absurdity of the world around him. The short was a collaboration with Paul Stuckey, the Paul of Peter, Paul and Merrie, by the way, who co-produced it and wrote the theme song, which actually had appeared on a Peter, Paul and Merrie album 2 years earlier. The character was initially designed by pop artist Milton Glaser, yes, the guy who created the I Heart New York logo, before being refined by animator Wallace Jones for production. And the content of this short is actually kind of incredible for 1968. Norman's boss orders him to get a client drunk to close a deal. Yeah, that happens. And Norman refuses on moral grounds. A party guest launches into a joke about a minority group. You heard me, that happens. And Norman actually calls him out on it. The bartender pressures him to drink and mocks him when he asks for a ginger ale. Throughout it all, Norman just tries to be a decent person in a world telling him to fit in with what they're doing. It's thoughtful, it's genuinely well written. It even landed on the shortlist for Best Animated Short at the Academy Awards that year. Paul Stookey had more plans for more Norman Normal cartoons, but the studio closure in 1969 put an end to that. So in the middle of this era of declining budgets and recycled formulas, there is this one beautiful oddity, a 6-minute short that broke every convention the studio had and did it with real intelligence. If you haven't seen Norman Normal, seek it out. It might be the most single interesting thing to come out of the final years of the original Warner Brothers animation studio. Now, here's where the story gets even more fascinating and maybe a little sad. You be the judge of that. Because the studio wasn't just winding down in those final years, they were still actually actively pitching new ideas. And thanks to some incredible archival work over at Cartoon Research, and I have a link below to the article, we can actually see what might have been. Under William Hendricks, the studio's director of public relations, who had been put in charge of the revived animation unit, there were over 30 new character concepts floating around in various stages of development. There was Super Snooper, a detective character, though the name had already been used by Hanna-Barbera on the Quick-Draw McGraw show. There was Butch Cassidy, and yes, that's Cat City, a feline take on Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, another timely reference. He kind of looked like a revamped Tasmanian Devil. Whether that would have been brilliant or terrible, more than likely terrible, but we'll never know. Jolly Roger was essentially a pirate character who, as Cartoon Research bluntly put it, looked like a rip-off of Yosemite Sam. And you do have to ask, since they already own Yosemite Sam, why not just use Yosemite Sam and just put him in a pirate costume? They've done it a few times already. They were even developing an updated version of Max Sennett's Keystone Cops as an animated series, and perhaps most ambitiously, they had plans for a TV series based on Al Cap's Little Abner. There were actual trade announcements and model sheets that survive. Oh, and there was even a pitch for Puff the Magic Dragon, likely connected to Paul Stookey's involvement through the Peter, Paul and Merrie connection. And here's one that kills me. There was a concept called Roadrunner Cavalcade with the Birdwatcher. If the Depatie-Freleng Roadrunner cartoons weren't struggling enough already, this proposed spin-off probably wouldn't have helped matters. They needed to get the normal shorts right first before they considered any spin-offs or anything. Now, none of these ever saw the light of day. In 1969, the Kinney National Company acquired Warner Brothers 7 Arts, and the animation unit was closed down to cut costs. All of these concepts, the model sheets, the storyboards, the development work, just stopped. It's a fascinating what if. Not because any of these ideas were necessarily going to be the next Bugs Bunny. Honestly, most of them probably weren't, and most of them would have been likely terrible. But it shows you that even at the very end, there were people at the studio who were still trying. They were throwing everything at the wall, they just happened to run out of wall, I guess. One way of putting it. So in 1969, the last original theatrical Looney Tunes shorts were released, and an era that stretched back to the early 1930s truly came to an end. The original run of Looney Tunes and Merrie Melodies, around 1,000 cartoons spanning nearly 4 decades, was finished. But the studio didn't just make theatrical shorts in those final years. Under Hendricks, they were also producing commercial animation, including a series of spots for the Plymouth Roadrunner car for Chrysler, directed by Bob McKimson. They also animated opening titles for a 1969 film called The Finks, widely considered one of the worst movies ever made. I haven't seen it. If you have, let me know in the comments. They even produced anti-drug educational films for Lockheed Aircraft featuring cavemen, because we all know cavemen and pilots go hand in hand, right? It was a studio doing what it could to justify its existence, and in the end it just wasn't enough. Now obviously this was not the end of the main characters. Bugs, Daffy and the gang would continue to live on through television specials, compilation shows, and eventually new series. But the original theatrical short, the format that built the entire franchise, was done. And I think there's something poignant about the way it ended. Not with the masterpiece, not with the grand finale, but with a series of cartoons that, let's face it, a lot of people today don't even know exist, made by a studio that was a shadow of what it had once been. And yes, there would be a few theatrical shorts released over time, but these would be very sporadic and usually there'd be special event things. So the next time you hear that version of the merry-go-round broke down, now you know the full story behind it. You'll know about the studio closure, the Bill Lava title cards that bridged the eras, the Depatie-Freleng years, the Larriva 11, the Daffy and Speedy treadmill, and the brief, strange Warner Brothers 7 Arts revival that gave us Cool Cat, Norman Normal, and Merlin the Magic Mouse. These cartoons may not represent the best of what Looney Tunes had to offer, normal accepted of course, but they're a fascinating chapter in the history of American animation, and they're part of the story I'm telling here on this channel as I'm working my way through every single Looney Tunes short ever made. In future videos, I'll be going through many of these individual shorts in much more details as part of the Looney Tunes review project, so if you want to be here when we eventually dive into the Larriva 11, once I turn 80 years old at the rate I'm going, we will put also Cool Cat under the microscope and we'll see, are there any more hidden gems in the Depatie-Freleng or 7 Arts era than its reputation suggests, so make sure you're subscribed so you can check all that out. But that'll do it for this video. Thanks for watching guys, and until next time, take care.